Education is what's important. Training, preparation for the expected. Education, preparation for the unexpected.
To all who shall see these presents, greetings. On behalf of Marine Corps University, the Marine Corps University Foundation, and the Krulak Center for Innovation and Future Warfare, welcome back to the Brutecast, our series designed to connect the worlds of the warfighter and PME with the best in innovative and creative thought. I'm your host, Major Nate Janikin, Operations Officer at the Krulak Center. Before we begin, please remember that all opinions expressed here are those of the individual and do not necessarily reflect the views of the Krulak Center, Marine Corps University, United States Marine Corps, or any other agency of the U.S. government. We will also be recording this webcast for the benefit of those in our community of interest who could not join us today, so we ask that you keep your own webcams off to help us stream smoothly. At the conclusion of our discussion, we will have a question and answer session, so if you have a question, just type it into the group chat and I'll go through them in the order received. There are many who have written on conventional warfare. Names like Sun Tzu, Jomini, Clausewitz, Mahan, Boyd, and many others will spring to mind easily. But few of those have focused specifically on irregular warfare, which has gone by many names. Even fewer have put in the objective effort to study irregular warfare specifically. In Theory of Irregular Warfare, Master Sergeant Jonathan Hackett, our guest today, explains the flaws in many of their studies. He then lays out his approach and his own take on irregular warfare. His book was published this year, and with that, let me further introduce him. Master Sergeant Jonathan Hackett is a United States Marine with 2 decades of experience running complex intelligence operations and special activities in dozens of countries across 4 continents. He now leads the only formal course in the Marine Corps that teaches how to advise allied and partnered foreign security forces. He has held positions at the Defense Intelligence Agency, National Security Agency, Marine Forces Special Operations Command, and the Marine Corps Operating Forces prior to teaching in Dam Neck, Virginia. In addition to his book, Theory of Irregular War, Jonathan has written academic articles and book chapters on this topic and has a second book in peer review on Iran's foreign policy toolkit in these types of conflicts. Master Sergeant, welcome to the Brutecast. With that, I'll go ahead and turn the floor over to you.
Thank you, sir. And hello, ladies and gentlemen. Thanks for tuning in. I see Reyes Cole and Colonel McLaughlin there. Nice to see you. So I want to talk about a couple of things today related to the underlying concepts that I put forward in my book, but without getting into too much detail from the actual examples in the book, because I don't want to spoil the journey for the reader. I do want us to start thinking about whether, if we could, would we be brave enough to find a new way to solve a complex problem that has cost us untold blood and treasure, and that has produced frustratingly few expected results. I also want to talk to you about whether ice cream consumption leads to drowning, but we can get to that later. I'm actually so glad that the title of today's talk uses the term irregular warfare, because this calls to attention a very specific problem that I dissect in detail in my book. That is, there's a difference between war on one hand and warfare on the other. Now, my research deals with the level of conflict that focuses on theory, that is war. Most people approach conflict from the lower level of practice, that is warfare, or the conduct of the war. And there's nothing wrong with that. Using the word lower level isn't negative, but these are distinct concepts that shouldn't be conflated. Irregular warfare has been discussed at length, as Major said, including 2 really good discussions, even recently on the Brutecast by Colonel McLaughlin. I want to bring attention to this crucial difference between war and warfare, though, because understanding this difference can, and it often does, lead to the difference between victory and defeat, depending on how you define those things. And if you're familiar with Sun Tzu, you've no doubt read that victory depends on knowing the enemy. That's from Sun Tzu's 3rd chapter on strategy. It's under his war planning section. How does it end? He tells us that if you know neither yourself nor the enemy, you'll surely know defeat in every battle. It's obviously not what we want, but we, humans, not just Marines or other service members, but humans, we're very sensitive, and we often are not good at objectively knowing ourselves or admitting what we know. And worse, we carry a lot of this bias in our attempts to try to know the enemy, who is obviously different than ourselves. And I know we're all familiar with the military's definition of irregular warfare. You know, terms like violent contest and legitimacy and non-state actors, these all come to mind. These are fine concepts for warfare, even for the warfare we may characterize as irregular, but these are not theoretical concepts. They deal with strategy, tactics, operational art, the things we learn about in the war colleges and advanced warfighting and all these things. We are very good at strategy. We connect ways and means toward an objective, but we, the military, writ large, we don't do theory very well. I'd argue that we barely do theory for an academic perspective on the word theory. When we're talking about a theory of irregular war, the definition of that term is very crucially important. We want to be analyzing the correct variables. In Theory of Irregular War, I offer the following definition. It's a little bit difficult to chew, but it's irregular war is the apotheosis of conflict between the people and the state, a violent dialectic between a faction and a sovereign exercised outside existing political institutions. So this short chain of words, a mouthful, and there's a lot to unpack in that definition, but I, with everything, like to start with history. So I'll begin by talking about how we approach history, especially from the military studies perspective, then how we approach problem solving in war planning, because they're closely linked, at least they should be. And it wouldn't be a good military talk without mention of Clausewitz, the ideas of whom a person may later find are not exactly what they might have assumed at first blush after I talk about it a little bit. So let's start with history. Specifically, I mean, the bounds of history that I use for my research, because it needs to be bounded by time somehow, or else there would just be endless examples to study. I chose 1648 as the starting point because this was a clear inflection point in the arrangement of sovereignty among states. At first in the West, but eventually the entire world, especially after World War II, the UN Charter, and the various international bodies that we deal with today. The very reason the 30 Years' War was fought was exactly over that question. Do states have ultimate authority over their own affairs? And if not, what other authority can exercise power over the state? Now, in the case of the 30 Years' War and the Peace of Westphalia that followed it in 1648, we were dealing with the Catholic Church as the higher authority, contesting the states in the Low Countries to violently resolve this question. That violent resolution over the question of ultimate sovereignty was answered in favor of the state. Now, of course, there's much more nuance, and indeed there is a whole web of path dependencies involved in that war. But the important question of sovereignty that I analyze in my book was really starting to be framed in the modern sense that we have today as a result of that war and its outcome, the Peace of Westphalia. But this inflection point isn't a bright line. There were early inklings of this sovereignty problem all throughout history, sometimes at greater and lesser moments. Examples abound. So was it Athens or the League of City-States who really exercised power over the treasury at Delos in the 5th century BC, Greece? Earlier, was it Pharaoh Ramses II who exercised power over Phoenicia after the Battle of Kadesh in the 15th century BC? Or was it the Phoenician city-states themselves, like Sidon, Tyre, and Byblos, modern Lebanon today, who governed themselves then? Fast forward centuries and millennia, and let's stop at the 16th century, at the nautical twilight, if you will, of the modern era that we find ourselves in today. Let's place ourselves in Yemen for a moment in the early 1560s. At that time, the Portuguese had just finished a 6-decade campaign of taking important ports and harbors all around East Africa, South Asia, and all the way to what is today Indonesia, contesting Ottoman control, Turkish control over those key sea lines of communication and robbing the Sultanate, frankly, of one of its most lucrative sources of revenue throughout the empire. At the same time, due to poor leadership from local Ottoman governors, the Ottomans were losing power over their holdings in the southern areas of the Arabian Peninsula, areas containing Aden, Sana'a, and Mocha. Familiar terms today, of course, from the news, all some of the most important transshipment points in the Western Indian Ocean all the way back then, 500 years ago. In those dramatic mountains, and if you've been to Yemen, you know what I'm talking about, there was an obscure sect of Islam calling itself the Zaidi. The Zaidi rebelled against the Sunni Ottomans with a little help from the Portuguese, a little early combat advising. The Zaidi began staking out their independence in 1569. They had a violent rebellion against the first inept Ottoman governor of Yemen, and then against the more capable military commander Sinan Pasha, fascinating figure on his own. Although the Ottomans eventually took control over the territory back in the 19th century, 300 years had passed. This took a very long time. That little Zaidi sect continued exercising sovereignty over very specific areas of territory that today covers most of northwest Yemen. In fact, the Zaidi is the name of the people that we in the West today call the Houthis, a name that we in the West use coming from a much more recent leader's name of that group. However, these people still call themselves Zaidis. They don't call themselves Houthis. Actually, this podcast had an episode on the Houthis not too long ago. It was very interesting. And the Houthis are in the news. The Houthis, as we call them, are all over the media between talking about great power competition and sea lines of communication and different conflicts coming up. But this group, not a state, exercises territorial sovereignty over certain parts of Yemen as if it were a state. It has exercised this territorial sovereignty to varying degrees since about the 8th century when the sect came into being. And it continues to do so today. Now, when looking at irregular wars, it is unfortunately common to take a really shallow, narrow view of time, history, and otherwise very intricate causal pathways, something that historians like to call the longue durée of history. We think in 6-month cycles, 1-year cycles, 3-year cycles. But to look at the big picture, we need to look at centuries, millennia, because these really matter even in very small conflicts, little flashes in the pan to us, which are not in reality. Now, without that deep history view, we and many others fail. We fail from the beginning. Why? Well, it should come as no surprise to the Marines listening who use the Marine Corps planning process on a regular basis. The first step is problem framing. Well, what happens when you frame the wrong problem? You begin solving the wrong problem. And very often, we don't look back once we've committed. This has its advantages, but there are also disadvantages to such an approach. This is what happened in places like Vietnam, Afghanistan, Lebanon, Iraq, Morocco, Congo, Haiti. I could just go on over so many years when we view it from the longue durée of history. But let's zoom out and use a little formal logic for a moment. This is for any philosophy majors out there. I'm not sure if there are. Let's examine a much less contentious subject, ice cream and drowning. It is a fact that during periods when ice cream is sold, most in the United States, this is a fact, drowning is also at its highest levels. Indeed, when peak ice cream sales hit, so too do peak drowning levels. Could it be that ice cream causes drowning? Or are these simply positively correlated? That is, they are moving in the same direction, and that there's some third cause, in this case, summer heat, that contributes to the rise in both numbers. So the attentive philosophy majors out there would also point out that there's another explanation, the fourth cause, and that is that the two variables could have no relationship at all, and that the phenomenon is a coincidence. Seems like a weird aside. So why do I bring up formal logic when we're talking about problem framing and war and violence? Well, we like to start problem framing from points in time that we choose. I chose 1648 for my research, not from points in time the adversary or some third party chose. We also like to favor our own sources, often containing recycled and biased analysis, usually in our own language, not the other side's language, rather than starting with a fair assessment of sources derived from the other side or sides. If you look at the Spanish Civil War, there were almost too many sides to count. We don't really start looking at those other sources until we're well into planning, doing intelligence preparation of the environment and things like that. That comes much later. well past that crucial first step of planning to solve the right problem. If I have any physicists out there, particularly specialists in fluid dynamics, you'll appreciate this. Imagine you have a highly complex system, highly sensitive to initial conditions. This system is dynamical, meaning it is very hard for us to predict what the system will do based on our own observations. Examples include predicting the weather, and sir, I think you're a pilot, so you'll appreciate this, predicting how turbulence affects wingtips of our aircraft, but also how pendulums swing and how snowflakes form, down to the very unique concept of the strange attractor. Again, seems very strange when we're talking about the planning process and war, but there is a way to predict these very complex systems with intricate webs of causation interacting with one another constantly. It's called chaos theory. And I wonder if we were in a classroom now, like I usually am standing in, and I asked all the listeners to raise their hands if they had used chaos theory when doing problem framing for war planning, if any hands would go up. Although I would not be surprised that none went up, I'd also ask, why not? I won't get into a detailed discussion of chaos theory right now, but I do encourage listeners to investigate this idea a little bit for themselves, especially in terms of causation and predictability, especially in terms of complex systems. So why am I so obsessed with causes rather than conduct? Why irregular war and not irregular warfare? Well, from Aristotle's treatise on physics to you pick, let's say, Immanuel Kant's Critique of Pure Reason and beyond, one can see that understanding causes, understanding first principles, and crucially human motivations, which we could talk about for hours and hours since I'm an interrogator, can help to set our approach to problem solving in a complex system in a direction that has a higher probability of success. And if you are in the world of risk management, you would probably want some system like that. Irregular war, it's one such complex system, one such system where the motivations of each participant, every participant, both directly or indirectly involved, can exert wide-ranging effects on the trajectory of the conflict. In irregular wars, those motivations are born and die within 3 buckets, which I label, and this is a conceptual heuristic, this is not how it really is, but I label these sovereign territory, political economic institutions, and social order. Those are the 3 buckets. Now, without getting too deep into the theories underlying these buckets and why I separated them that way, these are theories from political science, sociology, history, and so forth. I will say that these 3 buckets represent dependent variables. Well, to be a dependent variable, they must move in a certain way, a way we hope to predict. When an independent variable steps in and begins exerting pressure on that system, in the case of irregular war, I call this independent variable sovereign dysfunction. And I apologize if you hear the jets flying. I'm in Virginia Beach, so that's just part of the weather here. Now, this idea of sovereign dysfunction, this independent variable, it's a brand new concept. I created it. Don't expect to find it in a footnote of a book at the War College or a presentation to a J5, for example. But just because I gave this variable a name does not mean it is new. And as listeners should probably begin to guess by now, that's the case. The variable is everywhere. In every irregular war throughout history, we just weren't looking at it that way. We were solving the wrong problem. And now I won't get into too much detail here on the theoretical components of sovereign dysfunction, since I spend a lot of time on that in Theory of Irregular War, the book. But I want to just highlight some features that might be useful. First, it's an obviously negative term. Dysfunction implies a positive opposite. A functional sovereign is the positive opposite. And remember earlier when we talked about the idea of the state solidifying after the Peace of Westphalia in 1648, well, that sovereign, whether functional or dysfunctional, is the state in that sense that I gave earlier. That's what I'm talking about with the state. Now, when the state is roughly meeting, barely sort of meeting the expectations of its constituents, it remains relatively functional. John Locke actually talked about this at length in his second treatise on government. Very interesting to read. It's the kind of the book that spurred the Declaration of Independence. Well, he wrote that just 50 years after the Peace of Westphalia. He pointed out that he liked to call it great mistakes of government and a long train of abuses, if that sounds familiar, can be borne by the people without mutiny or murmur. Without mutiny or murmur. I agree with him. And what he's saying is people can be ridden very, very hard before they decide to do something to change that situation. So to reach the point where we have a sovereign that is so dysfunctional as to begin interacting with one of those three buckets I mentioned earlier, we need an extreme situation. In such an extreme situation, we have a condition for irregular war. In other words, let's say in the Yemen example, we have an extremely dysfunctional sovereign in Sana'a interacting with forces that are constituents of that state, the state of Yemen, but who are not operating as if the sovereign territory in which they live in the mountains is governed by those people in a way that is expected. This is an irregular war condition. And in this case, we are looking at the interaction between sovereign dysfunction and sovereign territory, independent variable, dependent variable. We could look at other cases such as the Dutch attempts at reconquest in Indonesia after the Second World War, or the British during the American Revolutionary War, or China's attempt to pacify the Uyghurs. In the case of Indonesia, it was the variable of political economic institutions, one bucket. In the American Revolutionary War, it was social order. That is, a change from a society under a monarchy to one that was self-governed. In China, it is sovereign territory. Now, these aren't mutually exclusive, but in these and many other cases, there tends to be an overrepresentation of one of the three variables. But remember, there could be all sorts of problems between the people and the state in a given case, but not until we reach Locke's moment, when so-called great mistakes of government arise, do we see an irregular war condition arising. Up to that point, we're missing the independent variable of a totally dysfunctional sovereign, and I stress the word totally. Let's talk about the case of the Dutch in Java in the late 1940s for a moment to highlight an important point. Toward the clear distinction between warfare and war that I have been mentioning several times, the Dutch had near perfect intelligence about the Javanese insurgents. In fact, the Dutch knew more about the Javanese order of battle than the Javanese themselves, which we've actually learned after the archives of the insurgents were made public later, their private journals and letters and so on. Yet with this near perfect intelligence, really a dream for a commander engaged in warfare, right? The Dutch still lost, but at the level of warfare, they were succeeding. They had strong combat formations, highly disciplined forces, great strategic planning, highly organized intelligence staff, and so on. But at the level of war, they were losing. And the reason for that is simple. We return to what I mentioned at the beginning about solving the wrong problems. The Dutch had framed their problem from the wrong starting point, failing to analyze the motivations operating across Javanese society, not just with combatants, failing to link the dysfunctional sovereign of an absent and then returned foreign power with the dependent variable of political economic institutions. I would be curious, very curious, to see how that war would have been different if the Dutch framed the problem by asking first, why is the government totally unable to meet the expectations of its constituents? Why? What is it about the failure that exerts such influence over the dependent variable of political economic institutions? Essentially, when denied access to functional ballots, the Javanese, with no other way out, no other recourse, opted for bullets to express their dissatisfaction with the dysfunctional sovereign. Now, this is a very different problem than the one the Dutch sought to solve. In a more formal sense, they were confusing correlative variables with causal relationships, adjusting their planning to meet their own expectations without taking the expectations and desired end states of the other side into account. They failed to determine and engage with the why behind the what. and so they lost. And I mentioned earlier that I would talk about Clausewitz. I won't let you down. We base a lot of our understanding on war from what Clausewitz wrote. There are quotes from his text all over our doctrine. It's in our signature blocks. It's in all sorts of ways we think about the battlefield. But what if we were using the manual wrong? Or worse, using the wrong manual? What if we could ask Clausewitz himself what he wanted on war to be used for? Well, we don't really have to look that far, because in the book, he clearly outlines what his ideas apply to. The ideas in On War, he says, are for a very specific type of warfare called Kabinettskrieg, or war between military cabinets. Now, there is some debate about what types of wars constitute Kabinettskrieg, this German term, but many agree that the last such case was the Crimean War in 1853. And many accept that these wars developed starting after the Peace of Westphalia, that solidified what a state military should do and be in the modern sense. So there is a 200-year period that Clausewitz's ideas apply to. And he wasn't even alive during some of those years. And within that period, there are only very particular types of conflicts that fit. So although battles like Marengo, Austerlitz, Jena, they certainly fit. The Peninsular War in Spain, in the same series of Napoleonic conflicts, does not fit. And I go into greater detail on this distinction in my book, but suffice it to say, even Clausewitz tells us his ideas do not apply to the types of wars that we fight today, nor even to many of the wars fought during his own time. Again, we should be cautious to run with assumptions about theory without actually engaging with the foundation of those theories first. Like measures of performance versus measures of effectiveness, we as planners, which I would say every Marine should be a planner, should be asking if we are using theory right. And more importantly, are we using the right theory? A physicist can't use the theory of relativity to explain the problems that the theory of quantum mechanics deals with quite nicely. And indeed, the fact that there are two such theories in physics is a major problem in that field. How can we expect our own science, if it is a science, our military science, to be special enough that only one theory can apply across all cases in the military studies field? I'd argue that it does not apply in such a expansive way. The next time you find yourself in a room with a planning team, whiteboards all around, charts and maps on the table, big blue arrows in a tidy PowerPoint projecting brightly on the wall, ask yourself, are we planning under the assumption that ice cream consumption causes drowning? Or could it be that the summer heat that's affecting an increase in both? And imagine if an entire plan to eradicate ice cream was formed around this, so as to reduce drowning. This is absurd, and I'm sure listeners agree. So could there be some other way to frame the causal relationships between the things we're analyzing? I believe that there is, and that other way, it's not elusive. I give it to you in my book. This is the theory of irregular war. Over to you, sir.
Thanks, Master. I appreciate it. The correlation and causation is probably one of my favorite things. Data analytics is one of the things I do on the background, and we don't do. Usually, it's not drowning, it's shark attacks, but
Yes.
it's the same exact concept. So that's good. So I think I wanted to start with what drove you. I think your background, your military background, kind of lends into why you might have focused a little bit on irregular war and irregular warfare. But was there anything else that kind of drove you to this project and writing this book in particular?
Yes, so actually my time at MARSOC really formed a lot of the very nascent early views I had. And I was working on my second master's degree, which was actually in irregular warfare. And my research question that I started with started like most would do when studying this, looking at the 5 pillars of irregular warfare and the joint publications and some other doctrinal concepts. And I kept feeling like there's something missing here. There's some other step that we're not taking, between the premise and the conclusion, we're missing something. And as I started doing more research and not finding the answer, I began to think that maybe we don't talk about the answer, or we don't know what it is, or it's not cohesive. And it happened at a very good time for this research, not good time for everybody else. But during COVID, I was at the U.S. Embassy in Jordan, working in the Defense Attaché office, and we can only work in there, physically. You can't do remote. So when the pandemic started, I was relegated to my house for 9 months, and I had something like 2,000 books in my house. And I said, well, I will just read every book I have. And so I started with military books and warfare, and I made my way through sociology, and I made my way through philosophy, political science, taking notes the whole way. And as I did that, I started to form the ideas that you see now in this book.
I think the other piece that kind of struck me towards the beginning, when you talk about when you're going through, the difference between war and warfare, and you talk about the different studies, you mentioned Jomini and Clausewitz and all those folks, but how they don't really focus on irregular war or irregular warfare. You brought up the idea, going through several PME courses, we talk about revolutions of military affairs and military revolutions. And I don't want to say that the book kind of, pushes back on those ideas, but you do suggest that maybe we're going about this sort of the wrong way. Have you gotten pushback from anyone maybe that's reached out to you directly saying like, hey, I think you've got the wrong idea about us having the wrong idea?
It's actually funny you say that, sir. The answer is yes. And when I was putting my book through peer review, academic peer review, mind you, one of the peer reviewers was furious that I had these ideas. It did not compute. He or she couldn't see, this other person's argument and kind of work through it. Instead, it was very bristling at what I was writing, which actually to me indicated that I might be writing something useful, because when we start to stir the pot, that's when we really see the ingredients mixing together. And I think a lot of times we have these things that Clausewitz actually called these sacred talismans. And in military studies, there's these specially, carved out areas that we are not allowed to contest. They're more than doctrine. They're very special. And Clausewitz himself railed against that. And I think that if we're all students of him, we should probably do something like that. We should question the frameworks that exist, because if they are excellent frameworks, just like in scientific method, if they are excellent theories, they'll stand up to our scrutiny. If they're not, we shouldn't keep using them. We should find better theories that answer these questions more precisely and accurately.
Yeah, we had a captain at EWS last year that wrote a paper on essentially the concept was MCDP1 is dead. Long live MCDP1.
I read that. Yeah.
Yeah, and it was the idea that we should rewrite that probably has some folks turning over in their grave.
Definitely.
So I did want to continue kind of on that vein before I went to some of the questions that are popping up in the chat. But there was one individual that you mentioned specifically. I believe he was a French soldier, Roger Trinquier.
Yes.
Talking about, he wrote several times as he had experience with the French in Vietnam and then in Algiers, and how we have kind of focused in on his writings and have some doctrine or TTPs that are based on his ideas. But if they were so wrong, why have we focused on that? Why do we continue to focus on that?
Yeah, I actually have a whole chapter in the book that deals exactly with that problem. And especially if you look at not what Trinquier wrote, but what Trinquier did, it makes you question even more deeply, why are we doing that? And there's a whole long tradition of using French, British, and German TTPs in our especially counterinsurgency operations, which is an operation, not a theory. We kind of apply these things because someone did it before and it worked temporarily or tactically, but those things don't work long term. In fact, the reason Trinquier left Vietnam was because they lost the war there in 1954 in Dien Bien Phu, and he was actually there and he witnessed that failure of the exact things he was arguing in favor of. Took those failed ideas to Algeria, used them there, they failed during the Dirty War, and then after the French were done with him because he actually tried to take part in a revolutionary thing against the French government, he was relegated down to the Congo, where he worked as a private mercenary, not much different than the Wagner group, fighting using the same techniques he'd done earlier, also not working very well. So I don't know why we cling to these ideas from an objective perspective. I'm a very objective person, so I can't think, maybe there's something emotional about it that I just don't recognize. But I think from a analytic perspective, we probably should be questioning why we're using those things.
Yeah, I think that was the big thing that popped out at me as I was reading through the book. There were several mentions. You go through the whole thing, and they'd be like, "Hey, Trinkier did this stuff and talked about this, and we're still doing this," and then go into the next thing, and it'd be the same thing again. And I found it interesting that we continue to do the same thing. So I'll go to the first question here in the chat from Lisa. It says, "Does your work, or are you aware of any material that differentiates between the military's execution of irregular warfare and the political execution of irregular warfare? I wonder if we conflate the two roles' activities too often. I guess my question is, are we actually studying the execution of political irregular warfare when we're studying military irregular operations?"
So I'll go right to the instruments of national power angle on that. Military activity supports the state, which really ultimately supports a grand strategy. That's what all those instruments combine to make. Politics, and this is an important Clausewitz thing too, when we say war is a continuation of politics, by other means, it's actually a mistranslation. It's a continuation of policy, not politics, which I think is something we often confuse even when we are studying and reading these things. Our eyes just jump over it very quickly and we just take it the way it is. But I think that distinction, kind of like the distinction between war and warfare, between policy and politics, exceptionally important. And I think that's a part of the reason the US has probably lacked such a coherent grand strategy from the last, since the Second World War at least, because we collectively aren't really getting down into that theoretical level. Instead, we're just executing, which in the military, we do it very well. Give me an end state and I'll make a plan to achieve that end state. But the person who gave me that end state, I would hope, would really deeply ask, why is that the end state? And not just because it's the end state of another end state and on all the way down, these nesting dolls all the way down. It needs to start with something at the level of policy, like the question asked. Politics is an activity. It's a thing that people do. Policy is an idea, theory about how people should do things, and it's a normative concept essentially.
I think that kind of feeds into the next, as you're talking about, give me a mission, give me the ends, and then I will figure out the plan in order to figure out the ways to do that. Alberts says, is there a point where attempting to correctly capture all the nuances instead results in something nearly impenetrable? And he mentions the infamous Afghanistan counterinsurgency dynamic slide that everybody jokes about. Or is this something inherent to attempting to force something like that into a PowerPoint format? So I guess, potentially you could freeze at the first step of MCPP, or technically the second step of MDMP or JPP, which is, that mission analysis, situational analysis, trying to create that picture of what's going on.
Right. I think we get very easily stuck on those spaghetti charts. I remember when I was in Syria and Iraq in 2016, we were about to take Mosul back from ISIS. And I showed up there, it was with a task force, and I was looking at the big whiteboard, and it was a whole whiteboard filled out with all these little lines showing which general had control over which element of our task force. And nobody could actually say to me that it was this general that was in charge of this thing. They had to refer to the chart because it was so complicated because of the way that our task organization worked. And I believe there were 22 generals at the top at varying levels, and only about 500 special operators deployed on that deployment. So it's about, one general per squad, I guess, which just kind of blew my mind. And it goes exactly to that question, is there a way to get frozen there in that first step? And I think the answer is yes. But I think that shouldn't be a reason that we stop asking why. And especially with Afghanistan, going back to the earlier question about counterinsurgency and Trinkier, the coin manual 3TAC24 was very largely based on ideas from Trinkier, Galula, and many others that were kind of taken and put in there into a different place, a different time, a different context. And I think earlier when I was talking about causal pathways and path dependency, we have to really analyze those path dependencies because they're not the same in any case. Every case is very different. Even cases in Afghanistan from the 80s versus the early 2000s, different cases, different path dependencies because things occur and change the way the flow of planning will work. But it's a great point that we can't just stay there at the very first step. We have to find a way to keep moving forward or else we won't have any momentum.
Do you think, because in the book, towards the end, you kind of lay out like, hey, here's all the, the theory of irregular war. Here's how it's different than how other people are describing it. We went into Iraq and Afghanistan. We had spent the whole Cold War focused on we are going to fight the Russians. Cold War ends, we start doing all these little things, and then 2001, Afghanistan, 2003, Iraq, and then we start focusing on these, I don't want to say low threat, but low threat counterinsurgency type of operations for 2 decades, and now we're shifting back to this great power competition. Are we gonna? I think in your book you kind of argue that we didn't really have it in the first place. Are we gonna lose what we didn't have and be worse off if we have to get into a fight like this again? And should we get into a fight like this again?
I think that if we use a military tool to solve a social problem, we will probably not have a successful outcome. Of course, you can define success in such a way that it looks like it was successful, but let's be objective. If we look at what was our objective in Afghanistan or our objective in Iraq in the first week of those military operations, did we achieve those end states later on? And the answer is probably no, right? But it's very easy as a military thinker to just take what's been given and not critically analyze how does this fit into the bigger picture, especially the social picture. Going to the Afghan example, they had shadow governments. That's not just a Taliban shadow governor, that's entire political systems that were a shadow component to the systems that we put in place. This should be ringing alarm bells to planners that, whoa, we're not solving a military problem, we're solving a social problem. There's a political issue here, there's an institutional issue here. Nowadays, we talk about institutional capacity building, very important, but is that something the military should be doing, or is that something that maybe other experts should be assisting? If the military is selected as the main instrument for that, okay, but we probably need sociologists, philosophers, area specialists, all these people kind of feeding information and perspective into that process. Otherwise, we're going to end up doing very similar things. And I think it's the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result.
Where do you think something like that should fall in somebody's career? If I have a young platoon commander or say, a young Huey crew chief in the back of a helicopter, when should we focus less on how we fight and focus more on, the combination of, hey, there's more that's going on than just the Marine Corps and DoD? Right.
I think a great place is formal schools. So, you look at how PME used to be. I haven't been there in a while, but when I was a staff sergeant, when I was a gunny going through advanced course and the staff academy, there was one class, one hour session on irregular warfare over months of class time. And that was during the war when we were fighting one. And that's just shocking to me. And I think there are places all throughout a Marine's career that there can be elements of this sprinkled in. We used to have language and regional expertise. We used to have the Center for Advanced Operational Culture and Language, which I attended to learn Pashto. I've spent 6 months learning Pashto in that program, a fantastic program, but we got rid of those things. And those were the things we were using to do exactly what you said, sir, to salt the force with some of these concepts all along the way, depending where they're going to go. But I feel like we're doing less of that now. Right now, I'm leading the Marine Advisor course. We are the only course in the entire Marine Corps that can train a combat advisor to work with a partner. That's kind of shocking because if you look at the national security strategy, it mentions allies and partners over 120 times in a 22-page document. And where are we producing the ability to work with those allies and partners right now? I don't know.
Yeah, it's interesting. I just did some work with one of the SFABs that's out in Georgia and listening to them and their experience doing a similar mission obviously on a much larger scale with portions of an SFAB in the Army, but it was interesting. I'll go back to one of the questions in the chat. Reyes Cole asks, in your opinion, do you think there's value in what was once called human terrain teams in order to properly frame a problem?
Absolutely, absolutely. And that goes just to what I was talking about a moment ago with having a sociologist on the team. And it should be a multidimensional team addressing these issues. It shouldn't be like a primarily military team plus some hangers-on who are sociologists. Instead, it should be like the human terrain teams where we had actual PhDs out there that knew this stuff so well. I remember when I was in Indonesia, I was partnered up with somebody from another agency, and he was the same age as me. We were both about 28, 29 years old. He graduated from Harvard University with a PhD in Islamic theology. I was a staff sergeant on a special operations team paired with him. And just the depth of knowledge that this gentleman had blew everything out of the water every time, because you would mention something about Jama Islamiyah or something in Sulawesi in Indonesia, and this man knew everything about that. He knew so much depth. I'm talking centuries of depth, and he could name families and tribal connections and things going back to the time that the Turks controlled Sumatra in the 16th century. That's something I didn't have. And I feel like that knowledge is absolutely necessary for planning today, because we were doing counterterrorism there. So knowing what effects taking out those targets would be very crucial. And sometimes we think we know that, and I don't think we do. I think we kid ourselves sometimes. We think that we'll just remove him from the battlefield and that'll be enough. And we've seen that that's actually not true. I mean, that's how we got ISIS in the first place, because we thought that just by decapitating the adversary, we'd fix it. Because we look at the adversary like we look at ourselves. Oh, we're a hierarchical organization. The adversary must be too. So let's use solutions we'd use against ourselves rather than thinking about what solutions work for the adversary.
Yeah, I was just thinking the human terrain team is, in the words of Obi-Wan, that's a name I haven't heard in many years. As we go into Force Design 2030 and we're making changes, we're divesting in some equipment in order to pick up, other capabilities. Should we be? I think I've answered my own question, but the investment in human terrain teams, is that equivalent to what we would need in the first island chain? Say, do we give up a platoon of Nemesis or Prism launchers in order to have an HTT?
I think that's a great question, and my counter would be, do we have to give up something? Because I mean, these are things that require mental brain power as a resource, not necessarily, but maybe require money as a resource. But if we are really carefully thinking about it, especially as an institution, I'm sure there are ways we can innovate within our institution, just like divest to invest. I'm sure there's ways we can take resource A from here and put it resource B over here and have result C that's actually very positive for both of those inputs. Especially when we look at Commandant's planning guidance, for example, which talks about standing inside the WES. Well, if you look at all the land inside the WES, that's not the United States. That's allied and partner nations that we would expect to be standing in. Well, how are we going to get access, basing, and overflight without having partnerships that existed before the conflict? Because just like in the special operations world, you can't create these forces in the middle of a conflict. You could, but how effective would they be? If you look at the state partnership program like the US Army has, they have decades-long relationships, like with Ukraine, for example, and Georgia, incredibly valuable. And this is something that you just cannot create in the middle of a crisis. You having, chiefs of defense calling American generals because those are the people they grew up with throughout their entire career. I mean, that is an excellent example of what we probably should be at least investing a little bit in my opinion.
Yeah, it was amazing that the team I was working with in Georgia, the general that came from U.S. Army Europe had been working with one of the generals from Georgia on like a dozen different occasions, and they had each been to each other's homes and different capacities, and it was just they had known each other for a very long time, and it was telling in the relationship that they had and how easy it was to get things done because of that relationship.
Absolutely.
It was, I've never seen any kind of Marine Corps, any interaction with a Marine Corps unit that on the same level. And it was definitely interesting. I think, we're in and up getting close to our hour. I was wondering if, I don't want to take people away from, hey, you have this book. would there be any other recommendations for resources that you would point people towards where they could get additional information, maybe stuff that could plus up what you've written about in the book, or provide amplification?
I would always recommend going back to first principles. So if you are questioning Clausewitz because I mentioned to question him, don't take my word for it. Go read Clausewitz. Read the entire book cover to cover. It's very long. It's almost 900 pages. But go form an opinion yourself of these books I mentioned. Trinquier, for example, read his book. Read Galula's book. Read Kilcullen's book and make your own opinion. I caution a lot against reading derivatives of these works because those derivatives are usually a derivative of something else. It's this long chain that just goes on and on. Like the Small Wars Manual was actually based on a manual from 40 years before that with Charles Caldwell in 1898, and we don't even talk about that. So I think we need to kind of go back to where these things came from and then start making our own assumptions. So if that's Clausewitz, it's Clausewitz. If it's philosophy, read that. If it's, something about the Middle East, I'd recommend reading Ibn Khaldun, who is probably the first sociologist that existed in the world. And he had the idea of groupness, which I actually talk about in the book. It's called asabiya in Arabic. But he talked about how when people belong to a group, they act differently than when they're individuals, which sounds obvious, but the way that he gets into it, you begin to see this happening in certain cultures that are intellectually related to that author doing certain things that are predictable based on what he said, which I think we should look into those nuanced areas.
Yeah, Reyes Cole did write, it seems your theory would also be valuable in determining the will to fight, not only from irregular non-state foes, but also from threat nation states as well. And he asked what you thought about that.
Absolutely. And, as an interrogator, we look at influence and motivations very deeply. That's kind of our bread and butter, because if I can hit the right button in a human brain and get an output with very little effort, I'm succeeding, And when we look at states, and states are just giant compositions of human beings, of individual human beings, kind of like the groupness I was talking about with Ibn Khaldun, they have behaviors and they have wants, they have needs. And if we assess why do they have the will to fight? What is feeding this? What is generating power inside of that will to fight that allows it to continue existing? And we think about other ways to satisfy the motivation that's leading to that will to fight, we might be able to deflate it a little bit. And I talk about that a little bit in the book, and I could probably talk about that for hours. I even teach a class on this exact topic, but I would recommend reading Robert Cialdini's book, Influence, to kind of get some theoretical perspective on that, especially about intrinsic versus extrinsic motivations. Very insightful book. And the CIA actually uses that for agent recruitment because it helps to understand why would this enemy decide to turn on his country and work for me.
Yeah, the LAPD actually offers a class on, for helicopters. If you're watching people, there are tendencies for people to do, like when they enter a building, you can actually position the aircraft in such a way that when they exit the building, you can have a sensor on that location, because people will tend to do the same things when they enter an unknown building and exit the building. So the idea that, people do the same thing all the time, you can actually teach classes about it, is pretty awesome. And I will also add that if 900 pages of Clausewitz isn't your thing, there is a children's illustrated guide to Clausewitz that is pretty fantastic, and I may or may not own it. So with that, I'm going to leave the last couple of minutes to give you an opportunity for some closing comments before we close out the episode.
Sure. So first, thank you all for listening. I'll mention two things. First, I highly encourage Marines listening right now to attend the Marine Advisor course that I lead, and the Security Cooperation Planners course, which is led by Colonel Chuck Western. We teach, like I said, these critical skills that will enable us to stand shoulder to shoulder with our allies and partners, which is the order coming down from the national security strategy. That is what we are supposed to be doing. And there will be irregular wars in the future, and having people trained at all ranks in those things that we teach will help us do better. We might not win or succeed, but we'll do better, which should be the goal for everything. And second, I will mention more personal thing that my second book, it's going through pre-publication review with the government right now, which takes a little while. It should be out soon. And in that book, I'm analyzing hundreds of recently declassified intelligence reports through Freedom of Information Act requests, also intelligence reports and other documents from other governments about Iran, specifically Iran's use of covert action unconventional warfare and intelligence activities or operations as its primary foreign policy toolkit. Every country uses these things, but Iran is using them as a primary rather than a secondary, tertiary, or even in the background. It is the foreground. When that book comes out, I hope you read it because I promise it will not disappoint. That's about it. I thank you for the opportunity to speak, and I look forward to hearing listeners here talk to me on LinkedIn or email to continue the conversation. I see a lot of familiar names there in the list. It's good to see you, gentlemen, and thank you, sir.
Awesome. Master, and thanks for your time and your insight today. It was very interesting. Thanks to all the folks that joined us in the chat today and those who might join us in the future via Spotify or YouTube. So that's all we have for today. So go ahead and carry out the plan of the day.
Thanks for joining us. As always, we depend on support and feedback from the Team Krulak community to constantly improve our offerings and reach a wider audience. So if you have feedback on this episode, please take a moment to fill out the survey linked in the show notes to help us do better. Also, if you have enjoyed this episode, please hit the like button and subscribe to our channel on YouTube or leave us a review on the podcast app of your choice. It truly does help us reach a wider audience. Thank you as always for your support, and we'll see you on the next episode.
Education is what's important. Training, preparation for the expected. Education, preparation for the unexpected.